I think it's a very different experience for an autistic child to be disciplined than a non-autistic child. You know, this traditional approach to discipline, this very traditional approach, which is based basically on intimidating the child and forcing them to understand that you're the powerful one and they're the one who has to submit to you. Now, I don't think that's great for any children, autistic or not, but for an autistic child, the consequences are not the intended consequences. It's not that they're worried that they can't have what they wanted. That's not really that important. It's not that they're worried that they're sort of lower in the pecking order than the adult. They don't understand that. But that's not the issue. The issue, the reason that that's such a painful experience for an autistic child is that they experience the pain of a fellow human being behaving to them in a way that is, you know, almost, it feels cruel. It feels as if it sort of violates the essence of what it is to be human. And it makes no sense, because these are the same adults who are the ones that they trust, the ones that they're looking to. And yet they're behaving in this way, which is so inhuman and so much not a role model.
So, Guy, we have talked extensively about trying to understand the experiences of autistic children. We've talked a lot about what, you know, how we as professionals or as parents can really try to support autistic children in our interactions by trying as best we can to understand what's happening in their brains, in their bodies, in their nervous system, right? So that ultimately we can create more trust and safety. What would be so helpful is to hear more, if you're comfortable sharing, about your own experience, both as a parent of an autistic son, and what you learned about your own son's, you know, system, brain, body, what you needed to learn about what was going on inside of him, so that you could be, you know, develop an even closer, more trusting bond with him. And then in your own lived experience, as an autistic person, you know, walking through the world and having your own experience, I think it would be so helpful to learn more about you and about your experience as a person and as a father. And so, sorry, I'm just going to get a little more specific. What would be especially helpful, if you'd be open to sharing it, would be, we talk so much about sort of sensory differences or sensory experiences that autistic people may be having, that sometimes can be harder for an holistic or non-autistic person to understand, that can play out in everyday interactions. So one question would be, if there's some things that you could share about either your own experience or your son's around, you know, perhaps the way that you can have a sensory experience in a certain environment, that would be really helpful to learn more about.
Well, on a sensory level, I think me and my son are both very sensitive to sound, and I could see that right from the very start when he was born and he was in the hospital, and he just had a very, very strong reaction to the slightest, you know, sound or movement, or somebody putting something in a bin or walking past. He was, you know, visibly shaken by that sound that other babies were sort of, you know, they just took it in their stride. They didn't even notice it. In my own case, so I obviously don't remember those very early experiences after I was born in the hospital, but you know, I'm sure one of the things that you'll come to as, you know, you're going through this, is that because I didn't know that I was autistic, I didn't even know that I was autistic when my son was born. It wasn't until I was 46 that I learned that. You know, people call it masking. It's not my favorite word, because I don't think it's a very accurate description, and it has connotations which aren't really very complimentary sometimes. but let's just use the word for the want of something else for the moment. I found myself masking. I found myself sort of whatever level of discomfort I had with sounds, I wasn't really. First, I tried to pretend that I didn't have any problem because nobody else seemed to have a problem, or I just assumed everybody else experienced it in the same way as me. And they were just managing it better, and that's just what I had to do, manage it better. So that's what I did, which looks like masking. And it wasn't until I was much older, probably in my 40s, that I realized, for example, when I was walking down a street with traffic, it was actually really difficult for me to focus on listening to somebody. And I actually had this impatience within me that I wasn't aware of for most of my life to get away from that road because the sound was so disturbing to me. Now I'm very conscious of it. And so I actually sometimes make an effort to plan my route when I'm walking, going on a long walk, to avoid roads as much as possible. And I take my son on those walks as well. So we have these walks where we advise. So I don't know if this is the sort of thing you were asking about.
Yeah, that's really helpful and powerful to hear that your description on like sound sensitivity, auditory sensitivity, and then how strongly you and your son might be experiencing that, but then also not having any information given to you that you know that was even happening, right? So you were trying to make sense of it, but without anybody saying, maybe you're experiencing these kinds of sounds more intensely, and then how can we sort of like having that acknowledged, recognized, and then how could we support you or help you or brainstorm with you to to kind of better manage that in everyday life. So that strikes me as one of the most powerful things, is that you had to kind of just try to figure that out on your own and make sense of it. And then also looking around at the people around you, like it struck me so much that you said you were almost like, are other people just dealing with it better than I am? Or right, like that.
But that's
would
life.
be,
I think that's life.
yeah,
I mean,
yes,
everybody in life, nobody has an instruction
yes,
book.
right,
Everybody's trying to figure out how they fit in. Everybody is trying to sort of understand, and it's a lifelong process, and most of us don't get very far in this process, how to live life in the best possible way. The reason that's more challenging for autistic people is because if you're non-autistic, what's the word you use? Elliptic. Is that
allistic?
Allistic? Okay.
Allistic.
If you're
Yeah.
allistic, you sort of, your mind works in the same way as other people. It's easier for you to understand the feedback that you're getting from other people's reactions because they're your reactions. That's how you react in certain situations. You see someone react in a certain way, you know it because you recognize it. If you're autistic, you'd react in a different way. So you're seeing people's reactions and you have to translate them without a translation guide, without having done any sort of translation course or anything like that. That's why I think it's more difficult for autistic people in this society.
Yes, yes. Yeah, that makes so much sense because you're constantly having to make sense of your experience without, with like at least a little bit more of a guide. And yeah, and so what strikes me too, Guy, about your sharing your experience with just like sounds and from being on like a busier street, you know, some of this I think are just different like degrees of a human experience. So so the reason why I say that is because I can be very, very sensitive to particular like sounds. And I live in San Francisco in an apartment, and it's loud. There's constantly sounds, and I can get very not only distracted but also very like dysregulated. I can get upset, I can get angry at when I'm trying to focus on something, and I can't tune the sounds out. So I have to use different, headsets and headphones and devices to kind of help me with that. but I think it's also degrees. I think what I've learned from many autistic people is that I still have a better, maybe like my ability to filter out sounds can still perhaps be a little bit easier than someone with a different nervous system who you know, for whom those sounds can be much more intense. So I think what strikes me about what you shared and about what's so important for allistic or non-autistic people to learn is that there isn't anything that's like different or strange or about your experience. It's just a particular you know, human experience that perhaps you're having more intensely than, you know, than
Yeah,
I
and some
might,
people are not,
because
I mean, autistic people are not the only people who have
that's right.
sensory sensitivities. There are many
Yes.
people who are sensitive in many ways, emotionally sensitive as well, who are not autistic. You know, I don't think there's anything exclusively autistic about it. It's much more common, probably almost universal, for there to be some big sensitivity of some sort with an autistic person. But the real challenge with being autistic in a non-autistic society is this the ease with which we can get a sense of what to do with it and what it's normal to do with what is normal to do with it, and whether we want to, you know, we don't have a sense of how our way of managing things fits and compares with other people's way of managing things, because there's a different language being spoken.
Mm. That sounds like a very powerful idea. I wonder if you could say more about that. There's a different language being spoken.
So, I guess, for example, in a conversation, let's say, an autistic person might share more about themselves, maybe more personal stuff than other people would, or something that's not very relevant or interesting to the other person, because it's something that comes up at that time as relevant to the answer to the question. Now, when non-autistic people are together, there's that shared understanding of what's appropriate, or what they deem to be appropriate. That's true also when autistic people are together, because there's that shared understanding as well, although it happens much less often. But most of the time, it's the autistic person living in this world where everybody else has this shared understanding and we don't. We're sort of on the outside of it. So people might react in a certain way. They might react in a certain way because they want us to stop sharing that level of detail, or stop sharing that. They don't feel comfortable hearing something that personal, for example. So they might, I don't know, they might break eye contact and look away, or you know, they might look at their watch, or they might sort of try to change. I don't know what all the techniques are that they use, but a non-autistic person would understand those things straight away. This person doesn't want to hear that, or this person doesn't feel comfortable with this. Whereas an autistic person, because we have a different set of social cues, wouldn't necessarily understand what the other person is saying, what is the other person is trying to communicate to us, consciously or unconsciously. So there's always this sense of having to navigate through, you know, it's like if you go to a foreign country and you don't speak the language, and everybody expects that you do, or maybe you can say just about enough to get what you want to say out, but you can't really understand very much of what they're saying. But they don't know that you're not from that country. It's a bit like being in that situation all the time.
Yeah, that's a powerful example, and makes complete sense when we think about you know, navigating through culture and language differences, right? And there's a real parallel there. And I mean, it really strikes me that so much of it, I mean, I'll just say this, that, you know, again, my experience as a non-autistic person is that one of the things that I treasure so much and have been inspired so much by in my experiences and interactions and relationships with autistic people is that that sort of incredible authenticity, is that sort of candidness, that ability to just like say something that is on their mind or important to them, or that they're thinking about, or whatever, experiencing in the moment, without this kind of really sophisticated kind of filtering system that, like, is this going to be appropriate? Should I say this? Like, what are people going to think? Like, for me, in my earliest experiences with autistic people as a young adult, I remember just being like in awe of this kind of saying what you're thinking, or doing what you're interested in or feeling. And I remember thinking to myself, I wish, in some ways, I wish I could do more of that, because it's more, I would be more true to who I am on the inside, instead of living in this society where I'm constantly, what, for lack of a better term, masking, right? Putting on this saying the right thing that's going to get approval, or right. So I think it's fascinating that in some way, always the problem has never been human beings. The problem is always the kind of societal, cultural context that
Well,
we live
yeah,
in.
but let's look at what's going on when the autistic
Yes.
person speaks without a filter.
Yes.
Why would they do that? So the common conception is, oh, they don't really understand what's appropriate. Common conception is they don't have any sort of social skills. They're sort of lacking in social skills. So they just don't have awareness of other people. What people don't see is that sort of ability to share, or that sort of act of sharing, comes from not having anything to hide. There isn't a filter, because there doesn't need to be a filter. And society is, the prevailing culture in society is all about, you must conform in this way, otherwise you won't be accepted. To an autistic person, that makes no sense whatsoever. Why would anything not be acceptable from anybody? And unless an autistic person has been deeply traumatized in a particular way. I mean, most autistic people have a level of trauma, but typically an autistic person will not judge other people. An autistic person will just accept other people as they are, because it doesn't make any sense. There's no meaning. There's no. I get confused. I get sort of really baffled when I see people judging each other, when I see people laughing at other people because they behave in a certain way, or have a certain habit, or something. There's always, that person just has a different way of expressing themselves. And I think that when autistic people are very unfiltered, it's because they have that sort of really instinctive acceptance of themselves and of everybody else. Unfortunately, that acceptance is not reflected in society, and that's why the messages that they get back can lead to a self-esteem, which is not self-esteem issues, which are not inherent in autism at all. I think autism takes you in a different direction, but it's the pressures from society that push autistic people towards low self-esteem.
Wow. That makes complete sense. And I think that that's the most important, at least from where I'm sitting, the most important takeaway, that again, the problem is the societies in which we live, the systems that we're that we're a part of, that we're existing in, and that's a very different framing and a very different understanding than the one that I grew up with about autism and neurodivergence. That again, the sort of the medical disease model, right, is so is still so dominant, that again, the problem lies within the individual, right? Versus the problem is this whole system that we've constructed that says there's a kind of a right way to be human.
Yeah.
And then everything else is pathologized. So I mean, I think that you're spotlighting that beautifully, and I think that's why, in many ways, many of the dominant models of care, and some of the, you know, the systems and the money behind them that are invested in sustaining them are shaking right now, because that's being spotlighted finally. And I think it's because you're willing to share your perspective and your understanding and experience that it is, you know, finally requiring all of us to have to reconsider, right, all of these aspects of care, or just, you know, what it means to try to connect with, build relationships with autistic people. And
yeah, and it's, you know, it's not just with, you know, neurology that it happens.
Right.
Humans seem to be like that. You know, it happens with race, it happens with gender, it happens with nationality and various different cultures. It happens with any powerful group who's frightened of losing their power. They want to entrench the norms of their group as the norm that everybody else must conform to. And that's what doesn't make sense to autistic people.
Yes. And I actually don't think it makes sense to anyone who's born human. And I think that that's like I believe very much that our you know, human beings are inherently good. Like, we come into the world that way, right? Born, you know, there's a beautiful book, I think, by Bruce Perry, called like Born for Love or Born to Love, that says this is how we all come into the world. And then we learn, usually pretty early on, that there are particular ways that we have to be, ways that we have to suppress what we're feeling, or how we reach out to the world and connect with people. And that conditioning, and then trauma, right, can happen very early on, and that really shapes how ultimately how people move forth in the world. And I think that is across the board. We're finally, you know, sort of maybe there's a bit more spotlighting of that now than there was even a decade ago, of just
well, they're two different things, aren't they? Because I think all autistic people, I mean, it's a bold statement, but I can't imagine how it's possible not to be subject to traumatic experiences as an autistic person, because autistic people tend to be much more sensitive, so these messages that are likely to be amplified anyway. But the amount of being misunderstood, being rejected for not being a certain way, are going to be enormous for autistic people. So it's quite sad, because people's conception of what autism is based on looking at people like me, who've grown up as autistic and been affected by the relationships in society that have happened as a result of that. That's one side of it. The other side is about the messages that when you're, you know, you've got to behave like this in order to be acceptable. I think one thing that differs between autistic and non-autistic people is that, see, both are not happy. Both instinctively don't want that situation. Both would prefer not to have those judgments imposed on them. But I think it's much more difficult for an autistic person to buy into that. It's much, and I think autistic people tend not to be able to understand why they should change themselves in order to fit into some demand that's being imposed on them. that lack of understanding is sometimes presented as a deficiency. I can only see it as a strength, though.
Wow. I'm struck by that comment, Guy, that it as a really reframing it as a strength. I mean, I just go back to how many autistic children I worked with over the years, like especially in school environments, right? In special education classrooms, who just, like as you just described, just did not understand what they were being asked to do and why. And it was like there was so much, almost it was difficult because I was the enforcer, right? As a paraprofessional or a teacher's aide working in schools, I was the one who was trying to teach, sort of forced to teach compliance, or forced to teach certain tasks that were meaningless, or appropriate quote unquote social skills, or whatever it might be. And I was in this awkward position of having to do that, knowing that it was, in some ways, it was all crap. And I remember just being in awe of how hard a lot of the autistic young people I was with would fight for themselves, right? In some ways would try to fight for their own dignity and their own refusal to conform or to comply.
Because I think one of the sorry to interrupt.
No, that's good.
One of the big differences, I think, as well, this traditional approach to discipline, this very traditional approach, which is based basically on intimidating the child, and forcing them to understand that you're the powerful one and they're the one who has to submit to you. The idea being that at different stages of childhood, children are testing boundaries and seeing how far they can push limits, and your job as a parent is to impose those limits so that they understand what's acceptable and they behave, all of this traditional way of thinking about things. Now, I don't think that's great for any children, autistic or not, but for an autistic child, the consequences are not the intended consequences. The intended consequences are to make the child feel that they are subservient to the adult. An autistic child's never going to feel like that, because it doesn't make sense. How could one human being be subservient to another human being? There's no sense in it. It sort of goes against their perception of reality. However, the effect it does have is very different. It's not that they're worried that they can't have what they wanted. That's not really that important. It's not that they're worried that that they've been they're sort of lower in the pecking order than the adult. They don't understand that. But that's not the issue. The issue, the reason that's such a painful experience for an autistic child is that they experience the pain of a fellow human being behaving to them in a way that is, almost, it feels cruel. It feels as if it sort of what's the word, sort of violates the essence of what it is to be human. And it makes no sense, because these are the same adults who are the ones that they trust, the ones that they're looking to, and yet they're behaving in this way, which is so inhuman and so much not a role model. I think it's a very different experience for an autistic child to be disciplined than a non-autistic child.
Wow. I'm just taking all of that in, Guy, because there's so many very important and powerful pieces there. Again, about understanding what discipline, or traditional discipline, the impact of receiving that might be on an autistic person.